Hello students, welcome back to Natural Ecosystems and Native Species Part 2. The PowerPoint is just too big, so I had to divide it into two pieces. So this is the second half for you to look at. And in this part, we're going to talk about important keywords. And the first one is organism, which is basically an individual form of life. And it can be a plant, an animal, bacteria, fungus. Also, we want to look at habitat, and that's the place where an organism or a biological population normally lives. Then we have range, and the range is really the distribution of species in a geographical area, like where they can be found. How far do they live to the north? How far do they live to the south, east, and west? And then adaptation, the adjustment or changes in behavior, physiology, and structure of an organism to become more suited to its environment. And a prime example of that are birds. Birds' beaks will evolve over time to become adapted to what it is that they eat. And then there's biodiversity, the number and variety of organisms found within a specific geographical region. And Florida has lots of biodiversity. So two more words, keystone species and indicator species. And a keystone species is a species that has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to its abundance. And it basically plays a critical role in keeping the population of other species in check. And a prime example of that is the gopher tortoise. The gopher tortoise builds a burrow, and that burrow is used by many, many different species, which is interesting. We'll talk about that when we're in class. An indicator species is one that presence, absence, or abundance reflects the specific environmental conditions. So in an example of that might be the Florida panther. Its absence, as in its population decline, is an indicator that development is encroaching into its territory. Okay? And then there's endangered, threatened, and species of concern. And you probably are familiar with the top one, of course, which is the endangered species, which means basically the species is in danger of going extinct throughout all or some portion of its range. And then the threatened species is basically a species that could become endangered. So it's basically looked at as something to be protected and watched to see if it needs to be put on that list. And then a species of concern is basically a species that might need conservation action. You know, it might need a little bit of its habitat basically protected so that it can thrive. And then ecological niche. This is a fun word. It basically means the functional role of a species in the ecosystem. And you can look at it as their occupation or their job. And this is one of my favorite species. That's right, it's a vulture. We've got two types of vultures in Southwest Florida. We've got the black vulture and we've got the red vulture, the turkey vulture. So this is the turkey vulture. And these guys really play a critical role in cleaning up the environment. We have a lot of roadkill in Southwest Florida, and they actually come along and clean things up and make things neat and tidy for us. Kind of an unusual job, but it works very well. Let's talk about a food chain. And basically a food chain shows how each living thing gets its food. And some animals eat plants, and some eat animals, and some eat other animals. So anyways, for example, a simple food chain would be trees and shrub. And a giraffe eats trees and shrubs. And then the lion might eat the giraffe. That is a food chain, even though it's 3 simple steps. But each link in the food chain is food for the next link. And the food chain always starts with plant life and ends with animal life. So let's look at this really quickly. Grass, grasshopper, toad, snake, and hawk. Pretty simple. Let's look at a food web, which is basically a food chain that has a few more steps in it, okay? So anyways, we want to talk about dividing up the food web and the food chain. There's two things. There's an autotroph and there's a heterotroph. These are trophic levels of an organism that its position occupies in the food chain or the food web. And we'll explain a little bit more about that in just a second. So here's a more complex food web. So here we are with the bottom of the food web. These are our autotrophs. Okay, Everything else is considered a heterotroph, okay? Just to make it simple. And then this is even a more complex food web. Here are autotrophs at the bottom. And another word for autotroph is producers and decomposers. So the next level up are the consumers, the heterotrophs. So everything from this line up and around, heterotrophs. Okay, so we've got primary consumers. They're basically herbivores because this is their food of choice. And then we've got secondary consumers. They primarily eat herbivores. And then we've got the tertiary consumers that eat the secondary consumers. And these guys are considered pretty much the top of the food chain. And here are the different levels just written down if you want to take a look at it. Sometimes the tertiary consumers are there's another level that's put in saying that there's a fifth level, an apex predator, but for this course we're just going to talk about the 4. Okay, here's a little video if you want to watch it. It kind of explains the different trophic levels. And here's another simple diagram for you. Producers are grass, trees, green things, anything that photosynthesizes. And then primary consumers, this is what they eat. And then secondary consumers eat primary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers. Pretty simple. And this I threw in there just because it shows the marine food web, not just the land terrestrial food web. I want you to know this, and you might want to put it in your notes. Phytoplankton is the bottom of the food chain. Zooplankton eats phytoplankton. Small fish eat zooplankton. Larger fish eat the smaller fish, and so on and so forth up the food chain. But the levels are the same. You've got your producers at the bottom, your primary consumers, your secondary consumers, and your tertiary consumers, which are your apex predators. Okay, that's it for the slideshow. I will answer any questions that you have when we meet back in class again. And thank you for listening. I really appreciate your attention today.